Testing. Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Joseph Terzakian Harris, and I am a dual major here at UC Berkeley studying Middle Eastern languages and cultures and ancient Greek and Roman studies. My favorite thing about Cal is the community. Everyone is so loving and so endearing, and everyone just wants to be together and help, and that includes our staff, who are very welcoming and very supportive. I would like to share a message of great gratitude towards our donors, who we all benefit from, and the support from thousands of them. Thank you very much. Now, let me turn to my introduction. Nikki Jones' focuses on the experiences of Black women, men, and youth with the criminal legal system, policing, and violence. She's the author of Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence, and The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption, which received the Michael J. Hindlang Outstanding Book Award from the American Society of Criminology. Her current research includes analysis of the interviews with police officers and video recordings of routine police encounters with the public, with a focus on those that involve the police and Black youth in high surveillance neighborhoods. Please welcome Professor Jones.
Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to our amazing staff who's already done some problem solving before we've gotten started today. We all good? Yes, that's all. Okay. Okay. And thank you for the introduction. So I am Nikki Jones, professor and H. Michael and Jeannie Williams Department Chair of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley, and it is a pleasure to be here with all of you in the room on a Saturday afternoon to share a little bit about my work and the work of my outstanding department, and of course all of you on the live stream as well. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the campus of UC Berkeley is sited on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. And one way to make concrete such acknowledgement is through the payment of Shumi land tax, a material way for non-Indigenous people living in the East Bay to participate in the rematriation of land to Indigenous people. With this in mind, the Department of African American Studies has begun a practice of giving Shumi annually to the Indigenous women-led Sogoreate Land Trust, an urban land trust founded in 2012 with the goals of returning traditionally Chochenyo and Karkan lands in the San Francisco Bay Area to Indigenous stewardship and cultivating more active reciprocal relationships with the land. And I encourage you to visit their website for more information. So for today's conversation, I want to do two things with the time we have together. First, I want to briefly introduce you to who I am and the work I do. I'm passionate about the work I do. I think it's important. And as chair of the department, which involves a good deal of administrative work, and that's an understatement, I rarely have a chance to talk about my scholarly work anymore. So I'm going to relish the few moments that I have to share my work with you, in particular the work on race, racism, violence, and policing, which is always a timely topic. It's work that I've been doing for going on 2 decades now, from the time I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania to the present moment. But most importantly, and the reason I'm really here today on a Saturday afternoon would not be to talk about myself, but I want to take some time to introduce you to the department that I have the honor of chairing, the Department of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley, and the world-building work of Black Studies. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term Black Studies, I use the term Black Studies because the title of the department, which is the Department of African American Studies, or also the Department of African American African Diaspora Studies, which is the title of our PhD program, is too long. So in using Black Studies, right, I'm acknowledging the experiences of the descendants of those who endured racialized slavery, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism in its many forms, as well as how those histories influence us all, Black people and non-Black people alike. It is also to acknowledge both the strands of similarity in our experiences as Black people, as well as the rich diversity of our experiences. Okay, so to start with the brief intro, again, I'm professor and chair of African American Studies. A couple of fun facts about me. I grew up in New Jersey, so I'm a long way from home. I left New Jersey to attend St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia on a basketball scholarship way back in 1997, and as I tell my students, I was a lot taller then. I stayed in Philadelphia to attend graduate school at Penn, where I earned a degree in sociology and criminology before taking my first academic job in the Department of Sociology at UC Santa Barbara. And I was on faculty there for about 10 years before joining my current department in 2014. So as an introduction, it's important to know that my work is deeply informed by the Black intellectual tradition and the Black feminist tradition. And for those who may not know the Black intellectual tradition, there are characteristics of the Black intellectual tradition as laid out by the late historian Manning Marable, who described 3 defining characteristics. So first, it is descriptive. It describes Black life from the inside out. It doesn't look at Black people as a problem, trying to figure out what's going on, what are they doing, right? It starts from the inside. What problems do Black people face, and how do they go about reconciling those problems? It is corrective. So it pushes back against many theories of inferiority, cultural, psychological, biological, genetic, any idea of some innate, immutable inferiority that has been part of the story of race in what has become the nation for some time, and we continue to contend with the legacy of that, right? So it is corrective. And it's also prescriptive, right? So certainly at a public institution, the work is part of the public good, is intended to do something. When you think about the work of the Black intellectual tradition, it is intended, again, to push back at those theories, but to set a pathway forward, right? To not just diagnose, but to help us determine what to do next, right? And so pushing back certainly against these racist intellectual categories that continue to circulate and white supremacy itself. No small task. Patricia Hill Collins describes the Black feminist tradition in her book, Black Feminist Thought, one of the books that I read in graduate school that really was super meaningful to me, really inspired me, and so many of our students confront texts like that during the course of their time here at Berkeley. And Pat Hill Collins describes the Black feminist tradition, Black feminist epistemology, as including 4 characteristics. So 1, the value of lived experience. Again, that value of subjectivity, the kinds of things that we do together and the kinds of things that we do in our day-to-day lives. 2, an understanding that knowledge is produced through dialogue and conversation, right? That there are many forms of expression and sites in which knowledge is produced. An ethic of care, right? So deep care for the work that we do in the communities that we're a part of and that we research and that we write about. And an appreciation of accountability. So always asking this question at every stage in the research process, right? And certainly even in the work that we're doing in the classroom, to whom am I accountable? So these paradigms have informed my ethnographic work, including 2 books on topics that, as I said, never seem to leave the news cycle: race, racism, violence, and policing. So here you see my first book, Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence, which was based in tough neighborhoods in South and West Philadelphia. My second book, The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption, is based on years of field research in the Fillmore neighborhood of San Francisco. And I've also studied the organization and impact on violence and its aftermath, both from firsthand experiences, or those who are most impacted by policing, but also from the other side of that dividing line that we often hear so much about, right? That line between the community and the police. And this is a picture that I took during field research in the Fillmore neighborhood. On one side, you have the young people and residents of the community, which was a hyper-police community. On the other side, you have the police and the folks who are at the heart of the book that I wrote, The Chosen Ones, are in the middle, right? They are trying to cool the young people out and also trying to cool the police out to some measure. And I think it's a really good illustration of what we often think of as that dividing line, and certainly that's become more apparent in recent years. So over the last 2 decades, I've learned a good deal from studying the problem of policing from those most impacted by policing and from talking with police officers firsthand, including how officer actions can increase or reduce the likelihood of force in an encounter, the routine ways in which racism gets into policing, and the consequences for those people who are most likely to be the frequent targets of policing. My work, especially over the last decade, has positioned me well when it came to both understanding and explaining the uprisings against systemic racism and police violence in the US and across the globe, what I describe as the rupture of 2020, when we saw in real time and the first time in recent history, calls for police abolition or defunding, right, displace and disrupt, at least for a moment, right? We've since seen a retrenchment, more narrow calls for police reform. We have witnessed a backlash and in some ways a kind of flat out fatigue with the racial reckoning that was since summer 2020, but we have and will continue to see the ripple effects of that rupture for years to come. One example of recent work I've done in this area is a paper that was just published in the journal City and Community. It's a journal of the American Sociological Association, where my research team, and I worked with graduate student research team, a wonderful team. I also had undergraduate students working in my research lab, both transcribing and coding interviews that were at the heart of this paper. And in the paper, we identify how explicit and racialized biases about people and places make their way into routine policing, right? And prior to the uprisings of summer 2020, the 2 dominant paradigms for understanding how racism got into policing were the implicit bias paradigm and the bad apples paradigm. And I'm just going to run through these really quickly for you. So the bad apples paradigm, in short, imagines that there are a number of stone-cold racists in policing, people who hold racial animus toward Black communities and other communities of color. They use the institution and the occupation, the profession of policing, to exploit those beliefs, right, and to deliver harm directly to communities of color or people of color. And certainly, we have seen cases in which officers hold these explicit racist biases and endorse explicitly racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, on and on beliefs. The Plainview Project is one example of that, which documented hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of posts and public endorsement of these kinds of beliefs on Facebook. Right, and so we know that it exists, right? And if we know that, if we believe that to be the major problem driving racial disparities and racial inequality in policing, then what is the intervention? The intervention, after this was discovered in Plainview, through the Plainview Project and other cases around the country, is to do something about those individual cops. And certainly, there's a very good argument for doing something about those individual cops. What we know, as a consequence of the protection of police unions and just a system of protection that exists and is embedded in the law, from including in Supreme Court precedent, is that it's very difficult, one, to hold officers accountable for bad behavior, and then to also discipline them. And so even the most progressive of police chiefs around the country may want to do what seems to be the right thing by punishing and firing, in some cases, officers who show these explicit racist beliefs. They often encounter a situation where they have a case of discipline, and then very shortly thereafter, right, that person is rehired, and or that person can move to another police department. So that's the bad apples framework, and I think many of us are familiar with that. The implicit bias framework, right, is that, racism lives in our hearts and minds, and especially our minds, that we're all a little bit racist, right, and that includes police officers too. And it's really this unconscious shorthand association between Blackness, dangerous, criminality, right? Again, think about those theories of inferiority I just briefly referred to earlier, right? There's some shortcutting that happens, and people might not even be conscious of this, but that somehow that is influencing encounters and influencing and generating and reproducing racial disparities. The research on this has, in particular, that links, right, implicit bias to disparities is mixed to weak. what we've seen from interventions, and the interventions, right, if the problem is imagined to be in your mind, you got to get in people's heads, and that's what people have done, particularly in police departments with implicit bias training, spending millions and millions of dollars, including NYPD, to train officers. And in some cases, you might see some short-term changes, but it hasn't been shown yet in the studies we have to actually influence actions and outcomes in the way that people had hoped that they would, right? So these are the these were especially pre-2020, right? 2020 was a real shift. These were the key ways in which people were thinking about how racism showed up in policing. So my team and I analyzed interviews conducted with over 40 police officers during ride-alongs, and we recorded our encounters. We recorded their encounters with the public, and we interviewed them about how they manage encounters both before and after, right? And briefly, we found that counter to both of those paradigms, right, to the implicit bias or bad apples paradigm, that officers actually rely on an explicit set of racialized biases about people and places that inform how they interact with people. They don't tend to see these biases as racist. If they did, they probably wouldn't share it with us, right? Implicit or otherwise. But they see it as a form of expertise that they've developed from observation and instruction, from doing the work and from the stories shared by their field training officers and peers, right? They consider themselves to be experts and professionals in the way that many of us here might be professionals, right? And certainly students who are training here at Berkeley are, expected to go on to some kind of profession, right? There's a specialized body of knowledge, there's skills, there's techniques, right? And all these things that the layperson just doesn't understand, right? This expertise also from their perspective is part of what it means to them to be a morally competent professional, to be a good cop, right? To not do that would be to be risking their safety, the safety of their peers, right? And any critique of this expertise is seen to be informed by a lack of understanding of what police work really entails, and or a flat out antipathy toward the police. And I think certainly you can see both of those strands and the recent discourse around policing over the last several years. So these findings help to explain why investments in police training and professionalization, which have been the cornerstone of police reform for over 50 years now, are limited in their ability to fundamentally alter the problems of policing. So as a result of this and other work, I'm spending a lot more time now thinking about alternatives to policing, right? Other ways that we can improve, ensure, produce community safety, especially alternatives as they are imagined from the perspective of those who I spent the most time with over the course of my career, right? Those most impacted by policing, gun violence, and police violence. There's a lot more to say about this work. And so much to say that I'm now working on a third book project, which is intended for a more general audience on police reform, police violence, and abolition. The book will synthesize and build on work that I've conducted over the course of my career, including recent work with community partners who are on the front lines of redefining safety in Oakland, where I live, right, with my family. So I do this work while centering the experiences of Black people and Black communities, right, which is one of the reasons I found such a generative home in the Department of African American Studies. And this is a good time for me to shift from talking about my own work to talking about my department, which requires a shift from the critique mode to cheerleader mode. And it may be harder to visualize me as a cheerleader, but I was once also a cheerleader. It's very easy to be a cheerleader for my department and to sing the praises of our faculty, staff, and students and the world-building work that we do. So, I was recently asked to share 3 facts about my department that I think are the most important for people to know. And I thought it was a useful exercise, so I'll share those responses with all of you here and all of you on the live stream. So first, the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley was born out of political struggle, including the struggles for Black liberation of the 1960s, of which we certainly felt the echoes and aftershocks of in the summer of 2020. It's important to know that at the time, those struggles brought together people in the academy and people from the community. And pre-Prop 209 and the general backlash against affirmative action, which we see, right, that continue, it was much more likely that these would be the same people, right? So the people here on campus and the community, that there wouldn't be that great distance between those two populations. At the time, the university was much more accessible and affordable, and that was reflected in the student population. The department is informed by a strong and unapologetic Black feminist history and orientation. We are proud of our foremothers, people like Barbara Christian, who was the first black woman to earn tenure at Berkeley, June Jordan, Margaret Wilkerson, and Veve Clark, and you can see our Black feminist roots there. And the department is deeply community-oriented and collaborative. We don't imagine ourselves as existing outside of the community, and we understand that the strength of our department relies on our collaboration and community building efforts, both within and beyond the department. And finally, which I know brings me to 4 facts instead of 3, the department centers the value of Black life and love and struggle and joy as a starting point for the work that we do. So these are the characteristics that define our department: born out of political struggle, living in that legacy, Black feminist, community-oriented, collaborative, and centering the value of Black life. By way of providing another form of introduction to our department, I'd like to share a short video that features my colleague and former chair of the department, Professor Lee Rayford, who, with Professor Tiana Paschel and Program Manager Barbara Montano, direct the Mellon Foundation-funded Black Studies Collaboratory. And I'll talk more about that initiative in a moment after we watch this video.
June Jordan, the poet, the writer, the activist, and also a longtime member of the African American Studies Department here at UC Berkeley, simply called Black Studies Life Studies. My name is Lee Rayford. I am a professor of African American Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. I am inaugural director and co-principal investigator with Tiana Paschel of the Black Studies Collaboratory. The Black Studies Collaboratory here at UC Berkeley is a 3-year project that aims to bring together artists, activists, and scholars, really to amplify the interdisciplinary political and world-building work of Black Studies. And I think we're in a moment where the task of building life-affirming institutions is more urgent than ever. Our project emerged out of the kinds of racial reckoning of the summer of 2020, where we were thinking about calls to defund the police, abolish the carceral system, decolonize museums, dismantle public monuments, right? Of course, all against the backdrop of health and climate crises. And we realized that Black Studies largely provides us the tools to think critically about those institutions, the narratives and the systems of relationships that we find ourselves in now and that will emerge in the space that comes after dismantling, abolishing, decolonizing.
A new generation will come out of you, which may begin, after all, which may be the beginning of the new world we've been trying to establish for so long. Because I'm not a pessimist. I believe that the people who have endured what we have endured for so long have nothing whatever to be afraid of, and I count on you. That's all I have to say.
Black Studies understands that knowledge is produced and circulated and put to use in a range of locations, not just in the seminar room, but also at kitchen tables, on street corners, on concert stages, in prison cells and lecture podiums. So what we're trying to do is give space to scholars, activists, and artists to think together and dream together about what a future might look like if the affirmation of Black lives were at the center and the foundation of US society. Activism is often seen as the primary or a key site of social movements, social change making, but activism is often in my opinion, narrowly defined as work in or against electoral politics or in policy making or different ways of putting one's body on the front lines. And I think one of the things that my research on and participation in social movements has taught me is that there are so many ways to contribute to what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee called the beloved community. Art gives us language for what is often unimaginable. A world beyond borders, a world beyond prisons, a world that is not shackled by the legacies of slavery, imperialism, colonialism, patriarchy, etc. Art helps us manifest what we can only dream. Alongside being scholars, historians, theorists, writers, critics, people come as dancers, as poets, as parents, organizers, and that is very much fundamentally part of the knowledge that makes Black Studies what it is.
So I love that video because I love my colleagues, but it also encapsulates the legacy and the spirit of our department, our ongoing commitment to doing the important community, institution, and world-building work in response both to the most recent racial crisis, but in anticipation, right, of the crisis next time. So in the time I have remaining, I want to highlight a couple of other initiatives in our department that I think really speak and reflect that commitment. So I'll say a little bit more about the Black Studies Collaboratory, the BSC, in a moment. I also want to talk about the Abolition Democracy Initiative, and then I'll talk about our Veve Clark Scholars Institute, which is a long-running undergraduate mentoring program in our department. So the Abolition Democracy Initiative, the ADI, also came out of the summer of 2020. It was a department initiative developed by myself and my colleagues, Professor Eula Taylor, Lee Rayford, and Tiana Peschel, and we knew that the kinds of questions that were animating conversations and debate in summer of 2020 were the kinds of questions that our faculty and students engaged with all the time. Lee Rayford often says that we are and have always been the Black Lives Matter department, both during and in between moments of crisis, and we were supported by Dean Rockaway and campus administration in this initiative. And I should say that the idea for the ADI both is responding to that moment, but it's also rooted in the work of scholars like Angela Davis and W.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois wrote about the failure of Black Reconstruction, the failure of the nation to provide the kinds of social systems and institutions that would actually allow for a multiracial democracy post-emancipation. We didn't get that, and one of the reasons we are contending with the challenges that we face again and again and again is because we didn't do that in that moment, right? The ADI is organized around 5 key objectives, and I'll just highlight the last 3 here, both to strengthen the foundation of our department. As many of you know, African American Studies in K through 12 is under attack. Seeming ceaselessly, right? It becomes a political flashpoint. And certainly that's true of departments like ours around the country, including in spaces where it is now banned to do the kind of work, right, that we do. So to strengthen the foundation of our department in a key moment, to generate and amplify important ideas centered in Black humanity, right? That is not an open question, that is our starting point. And to create opportunities for joyful and generative engagement among Black faculty, students, staff, and the entire community, right? We all remember summer 2020. It was a challenging time, and what we knew then was that we were going to need spaces where we could come together, we could be together, we could do the kind of building, joyful, generative work that's so characteristic of our tradition. The initiative supported the Critical Conversation Speaker Series. In that series, we honored Dr. Barbara Christian, who was a founder of our department, architect of Black feminist criticism. In 21-22, we honored the work of June Jordan, a prolific, gifted writer, activist, poet, and innovative teacher, and again, a longtime member of our department. And last year, we celebrated, we used the ADI support to celebrate the 25th anniversary of our PhD program. And one of the best things about Berkeley is our students, including our undergrads and our graduate students. And our graduate students have truly gone on to do groundbreaking, field-breaking, innovative, creative work, both within the academy and outside of the academy. The ADI also supports the Veve Clark Institute for Engaged Scholars, and this is our premier undergraduate mentoring program. We have a cohort anywhere between 10 to 12 students. It's named for Veve Clark, also a literary critic and outstanding mentor in our department. And undergraduates get this unique experience where they get to meet monthly with faculty members, they get to engage with graduate student mentors, and we get to spend time together. We get to prepare them if they have hopes for attending graduate programs. And we've had students attend medical schools, law schools, other professional schools, and have gone on to prestigious peer institutions as well. I mentioned the Black Studies Collaboratory, just a little bit more detail on that. The Black Studies Collaboratory is supported by a $2.8 million award from the Mellon Foundation. This was the largest Mellon Award granted to campus in campus history. It supported 2+ years of programming, including supporting fellowships that included an artist in residence, an activist in residence, and one of our favorites, an elder in residence, right, who worked closely with undergraduates, research assistants, and really developed transformational intergenerational relationships. Another highlight of the Black Studies Collaboratory was the Open University series. Again, right, the work that we do isn't just about what happens in the seminar room, but bringing a series of events and along a range, and there are a few examples here, to the public. So free public event, 2-hour talks, engagement with the community, and an additional highlight, I would say, is sharing the ability to do research outside of just what you might imagine of faculty. So they supported a small grant program that went to faculty, students, and staff. Right? And all of these activities, again, help to curate those kinds of spaces across generations, across different kind of work, where we could dream about other worlds. I'll say the Black Studies Collaboratory also supports the Black Panther Party Elders Project. This is Professor Eula Taylor, and she leads that project. And it's an oral history project with elders of the Black Panther Party. She has a student from the journalism school working with undergraduate students to collect oral histories with elders, and those oral histories will be documented and deposited into collections, and they're also producing podcasts associated with that. Again, this kind of creativity. One of the, Eula Taylor, Professor Taylor, along with myself, were the faculty members for the Veve Clark Institute, and one of the things that we were able to do in the Institute was, with the support of the Abolition Democracy Initiative, was to bring students on a learning experience, right? So to bring students, our Clark scholars, to Montgomery, Alabama, to visit the civil rights sites there, and then to go on and to visit the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice. So again, this is another example of how we're bringing, right, what we learn in the classroom out into the world, connecting with our ancestors, right, and the work that other scholars have done before us, right, connecting with that history here in the US, right, and also investing in our future, investing in our students, and no matter what the work that they go on to do. Again, I think we are unapologetic about how much we love our students, the students that come into our classroom, whether or not they end up majoring in our department. This group here was our group of Veve Clark scholars. We visited the From Mass Incarceration to Slavery Museum, right? And then we visited the other part of the memorial, which is on a hill about a 15-minute drive away, that's honoring the victims of people who've been lost to lynching, right, and racial terror during the period that we often describe as the Jim Crow era. So that was a powerful experience. We're planning an experience now to go to Charleston, South Carolina, to visit a new museum there the International African American Slavery Museum, as some of you may know. Charleston is the largest port of enslaved Africans into North America. It is also, as a consequence of that, home to the rich Gullah Geechee culture, right, and Sea Island culture. And again, this is another example of helping our students to understand how our legacy lives, both our cultural legacies, but our intellectual legacies as well. So I hope you can see with just a brief description of the department initiatives that I covered why I'm so honored to be chair of this department. We are both inspired by the legacy of Black Studies at Cal and are also actively shaping its future. And so I want to wrap up here with a short excerpt from the work of one of our department's foremothers that I've mentioned earlier, June Jordan. It's from the preface to Jordan's book of essays, Civil Wars. I turned to Jordan's essay collection after reading an article in New Yorker magazine about Jordan's abolitionist vision for rebuilding Harlem back in 1964, following uprisings sparked by the police killing of a Black teenager named James Powell. There's so much in Civil Wars that speaks to the present moment, that is prescient, and that provides something of a roadmap, and certainly an inspiration for thinking about my work and the work of our department today. In this excerpt, Jordan is writing about the battle to protect her mind and her spirit as a young Black woman. She writes, "It was the week after the Harlem riot of 1964, a week of lurching around downtown streets like a war zone refugee, that I realized I now was filled with hatred for everything and everyone white. Almost simultaneously, it came to me that this condition, if it lasted, would mean I had lost the point. Not to resemble my enemies, not to dwarf my world, not to lose my willingness and ability to love." What came next for Jordan was a very real reckoning, to borrow from the language of summer 2020, first with herself. Jordan continues, "So back in 1964, I resolved not to run on hatred, but instead to use what I loved, words, for the sake of the people I loved. However, beyond my people, I did not know the content of my love. What was I for?" This led Jordan to a partnership with R. Buckminster Fuller, to whom she proposed a collaborative architectural redesign of Harlem as my initial deliberated movement away from the hateful, the divisive. Jordan's reckoning with herself led to dreaming and to the necessity of connection. She writes, quote, "My sometime optimism born of necessity hardened into a faithful confidence carried by dreams, detailed explorations of the alternatives to whatever stultifies and debases our lives. It is only after dreaming, collaboration, connection, that Jordan, as she writes, felt safe in my love again." In addition to protecting her spirit from irrevocable harm, the effort put into building a new world through architecture also helped to clarify the purpose of the fight. What was I for? And that question is answered by yet another question Jordan posed to herself and to us. And this is the question, the one that animates so much of my work and the work of our department. What kinds of schools and what kinds of streets and what kinds of parks and what kind of privacy and what kind of beauty and what kind of music and what kind of options would make love a reasonable, easy response? It can be so easy to see Black studies, African American studies as anti, but that is the opposite of what it is. And I believe that June Jordan's excerpt illustrates that and really grounds us. So I see this in my journey, and I know the work of our department is about figuring out an answer to this question, is about remembering the importance of joy and love and truth-telling and celebration. And I can't end without one mention of the biggest celebration on campus. So if you have students here who are Black identified, if you're an alum, you may have participated in this. One of the things that our department does, just like other departments on campus, we host a graduation for our department for PhDs, masters, and undergrads who are receiving degrees in African American studies, and we invite all Black identified students from across campus, right? And so I think we had over 100 students last year. We partner with African American Student Development, the Cal Black Alumni Association. And it is a joyful event. It is my favorite event of the year. This is me with one of my students and also my little one there. You can't quite see. But it is a family celebration. And anyone who poured any ounce of love and commitment into that graduate, you can feel in the room whether they're there or not. If you are inspired by the work that we do in the same way that I am, I encourage you to be connected with us. You can find our website, you can find our listserv on campus, and certainly you can donate to our department. We have a general fund, we have a Black Graduation Celebration Fund, we have a fund where you can support our Clark Scholars, our undergraduate scholars, and ultimately my hope is that what I shared with you today feels like an invitation, right, both into the conversation, into the work of our department. Thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes for comments, questions. Yes.
Hi, Professor Jones. So my name is Lawanda Knox, and I'm here with my husband, Zachary Knox, who is a second-generation Cal.
All right.
And my mother-in-law, Dr. Janice Vaughn Knox, was first-generation Cal alum.
Beautiful.
And our two sons and nephew, who will hope to be third-generation.
Yes.
So there.
Yeah.
So my question is, what do I tell them about keeping safe as young Black males in this current environment of ever-present racist cops and mass incarceration?
Well, I'm going to answer that 1 second. First, I want to know if either of you knew any of the folks that I mentioned from the department.
Ms. Taylor?
Yes, Professor Taylor, did you take a class?
Yes.
It was hard, right?
It was. It is Harry Edwards.
And Harry, he's not here anymore, no. But yes, Harry.
I want to say I was on the picket line to have
Thank you. Thank you. You know, thank you for sharing that, because when I teach my classes, sometimes students can get so overwhelmed and they say, well, you know, Dr. Jones, nothing ever changes, you know, like, and I say the fact that we are here is only a consequence of the battles that were fought for us to be here, right? For me to be a professor of African American Studies is because people like you demanded a department, right? And so it may not be obvious the change, right? But, you know, and sometimes it can seem slow, but I think it's really important for us to highlight for our students the very real change. And now to your question, which is a deep question and one I think about a lot, and I already know that you have the knowledge and wisdom in your family, right, to guide your children in that way. And I think it's also important for people to understand how, for so many of us, that's not a theoretical question, right? It's not a hypothetical question, right? It's a question, and so we can have people who study the issue, study the problem, from a distance, but again, that Black intellectual tradition, that subjective experience, that is my baby, right? That is my child, that is my nephew, right? That is my grandson. And so it hits differently. And so what it means to be safe, I think for young Black people today, and this is a question that I have been studying for 20 years now, requires something that they do, right? And kind of just a wisdom that's passed along. They have to reconcile that with their sense of self and their identity, because some of what we can sometimes ask them to do is to be smaller. Why? Because we want them to come home. But other people don't have to operate in the world being smaller. Their world opens up and opens up and opens up, right? And so the world of our children should be able to open up in that way as well. And we know that safety has always been an issue. So we do have to do something about the world in which they live. We do have to do something about that. And one of the things I write about in The Chosen Ones, for us, the grown-ups in their lives who care for them, we have to be both buffers and bridges, right? So and you know, some of the young people that I've spent time with don't have the benefit of families who can provide that buffer in a really strong way, which means that other people in the community, right, other mothers, other mentors, right, have to step in and be that buffer between the violence and them. Right, the potential for violence, and then there's ways to do that just by what we put in their heads and their minds. But sometimes, one of the things I notice quite clearly in my fieldwork is that we have to get in between. We literally have to buffer some young people from the violence. And then to be bridges, and to be constantly thinking about bringing them into spaces where they can be their full selves, right? Where they can both understand the violence that exists in our world, that shapes our world, defines it, and also that we have always found spaces to create joy, to be together, right? And that community provides its own kind of buffer as well. And so one of the things I would say that in particular at Berkeley, for students today at Berkeley, for Black students today at Berkeley, is to find those spaces where people are, right? And people have come in with different strategies for how to cultivate that. Students have conversations among themselves. But I do think that one of the things that keeps us safe is community, is being in community. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you use the mic for the live stream, please?
I understand that implicit bias training perhaps falls short of expectations in its use in police departments. Mm-hmm. Have you explored the use of AI not to kind of exacerbate bias, but to systematically impede bias in police departments?
So I do think a lot about AI and technology and the way that police departments have used that to make their work more efficient. They often don't think of that, making their work more efficient from the inside as an institution when it comes to AI and how they use it. I mean, much of the professionalization of policing has been about increased efficiency and responding to critiques of racism and racial bias by doing things like implicit bias training. But what could that look like? So one thing that people have taken up is to try to use algorithms to predict problematic officers, right? And so who are those officers that are most likely to do harm or to use excessive force in the future? Now the challenge is that even when you do that, the police officers are so protected that it's hard to actually do something. As a profession, I think it operates differently from other kinds of profession that have less autonomy and don't have a police union, right? So unions are great for lots of things. And we've seen that the way, from my perspective, and we've seen the way that police unions have made the incorporation of things like that would be used for accountability on the part of within the institution. We've seen a lot of pushback against that.
I mean, perhaps also in the way, a programmer uses AI as a companion to help them be more efficient. Can a police officer use AI to be less biased?
Yes, and so that's where I've spent more of my time. And one of the things we know with AI, wherever it's used, is that it tends to embed the biases of society that already exist. And so then what happens is that it just makes, again, the work of the institution more targeted, more precise. And so, for example, predictive policing is an example of a technology that emerges, and this one, we began to see more embrace of this after Ferguson, and as we move through like racial crises and financial crises, right? We have these tools, right, and they can work better, and they can eliminate some of this human error around racial bias. But we just see this, and officers will say, well, this will help us be less racist, right? It's not about race. The computer's just telling us where to go. The computer's not racist. But one of the things that we've seen is that, in fact, it's reproducing the kind of racial inequalities that already exist, making that more narrow. And when you begin to look at its ability to accurately predict where crime will happen, it doesn't always do much better. In some ways, and sometimes it does a lot worse than a human would do, right? And so that's just to say that, I think AI and technology are entering policing in the same way that it's entering other professions and impacting other professions. And the kind of key takeaway from people who are doing work like I do, and people like Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin, would be to be very wary of its ability to solve a racial problem that is deeply embedded in our history. There is no quick fix out of it, you know? And at the same time, there may be some ways, right, that we could imagine technologies that do increase accountability. Like no one, I don't think, expected, definitely not law enforcement, did not expect that video cameras, body cameras, would be used to detect police wrongdoing. But we've seen in cases where it's done just that, right? From the planting of evidence, right, to other forms of police behavior that officers would now be held accountable for in ways that they wouldn't have been previously. Because maybe it was an open secret, but you didn't have that kind of documentation. Yeah, but it's a big question, the technology piece. Yeah. Did I see a hand over here? And we might be at time. Okay. Yeah.
You know, we had the recent decision from the Supreme Court on affirmative action. What do you think the impact is going to be on students applying to elite universities because of that decision?
Yeah, I think that it's going to do the same thing that it did here at Berkeley, which is the black population, which went from 11%, maybe over 11% after Prop 209, decreased substantially. So now I think that we're probably under 5%, 3%, right? Although there's a lot of work going into trying to increase that and open that up, right? So you're going to see the same thing at elite institutions. You may see as a consequence of that more enrollment in HBCUs, right? And certainly folks do wonderful work there. But I think, you know, one of the things to kind of pull back on is that what I've encountered in talking to Black alum over the last couple of years, or several years I would say, is that they experienced Prop 209 as a symbolic kind of violence against them. And it disrupted their relationship with the university for until now, right? So people who graduated after Prop 209. And I think that's important because it is a real kind of violence, right? It is an institutional form of violence. It's targeted at Black people, and it's intended to send a message. And at the same time, you know, people will continue to do the work, and we do have a vibrant Black community here, and I think people have invested in that over recent years, and that's a good thing. But I think that we also know that these attacks aren't going to stop. So, yes, right? And so, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, right, in helping people to understand why race and racism still matter, and still matter for educational experiences.
Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
What are your thoughts about Kindy X and everything going on at Boston University?
My thoughts are, give me $30 million, give my people $30 million. What do you think we're going to do with that? Like, if you see like the amazing work we did with $3 million, just under $3 million. So I do have a lot of thoughts about that. You know, I think that we can't imagine ever that this work can be done with one person. That is not our tradition. That's not how anything has ever gotten done. And I do think that these kind of paradigms and orientations are really deeply important. And I think that there's a way in racial crisis, institutions want to do something. People want to do something. And if that's a visible thing to do, people will do that, which is why our work is so important, right? So these are the other things you can do. These are the other places you can invest. These are the other places you could start. You could start right in your community, right? And so I have a lot of thoughts on that, and I've been thinking about a lot over the last couple of weeks. And where I come down again and again is, you give us some money, I promise you, you will not have that problem.
You can manage it.
Yes, we could. We have demonstrated that.
So we have a lot of questions about recent news, and recently there have been some states that have decided that there's no value in Black studies. So I guess for the benefit of the live stream, could you say one more time why Black studies is important and the value that we should be getting out of it?
It's a truth-telling tradition, and it's not. And I say that And at the same time, it is not as if everybody in Black Studies agrees on everything, right? So there's a lot of debate and conversations that happens within that. But I think what we need is a true telling of our history. We cannot think about the way that Black Studies or critical race theory, intersectionality has been made a caricature, right? The kind of what's circulating about it is not what it is. And at the same time, there is great value to these orienting paradigms, right? And there is great value to bringing critical race theory to K through 12 education. And why do I say that? Because I teach course 5B, African American Life and Culture in the US. And as you know, we get students from the best schools in the country, right? We get the best students from all kinds of schools in the country. And they come into my classroom, and this is the first time that they are hearing about this history. This is the first time they're hearing about this history. They are just entering, for our students who aren't, non-traditional students, into being and who have citizenship status to being voting members, right, of the national community, and they don't know this history. So when someone asks them about the history of police violence or what we should do about police violence, when someone asks them about reparations, absolutely no context for actually making sense of it, because they don't have that history. So if we really want an informed citizenry or a national body republic, and it's a big if, because we know some people just flat out don't want it. But if we really do want that, then this history is intentional, is necessary. And I don't take seriously this idea that to teach this history is to make people feel bad. Because that's not anyone's intention in teaching the history, to feel bad about themselves. That's not anyone's intention in teaching the history. And I teach, students from across, because, it's the students who come into my classroom, it's a very diverse group of students, right, including white students. And I will tell you, I have students in my class who are the descendants of slaveholders and the descendants of the enslaved. So that history is real. People are living with the benefit and the burden of it, right? And so we need the tools to help people understand that. And so there are a lot of emotions that come from learning this history. Guilt, sadness, anger. Anger is one I embrace a lot. And that's okay, because our emotions tell us something. Right, and we can be in conversation with our emotions. It's not the end point, right? And it's okay to hold uncomfortable feelings. And then what do we do next, right? And so, but I will say, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because some of what I said today would get me in a lot of trouble in other states, in Florida, right? In colleges in Florida, for example, that is real, and that's chilling, right? And I think we can sometimes think that this is all political theory with no impact, right, or consequences if you have the privilege of not being the person who's going to be impacted or targeted, right, by the political theater. And so I appreciate you bringing that up, because it is very real. And I remind my students that we are in a privileged space, right, and our ability to talk and think in this way, one, wasn't always here, right, and in some places isn't there right now. So that's real. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. We're at time, and thank you for your important work in this lecture. It will be on the UC Berkeley YouTube channel, so we can share it, and many more people will see it. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.